Another topic that most of the fellows were very, very eager to hear on was on environment and climate, and how it intersects with the legal dimension specifically. So, if we know anything about the legal backdrop of how environmental policies operate in Pakistan, then I think Rafay Alam's name requires no introduction. But still, he is an environment lawyer affiliated with numerous institutions and universities where he teaches about environmental law and water policies, amongst a whole lot of other related subjects. He has also served as chairman at the Lahore Electric Supply Company and Lahore Waste Management Company. He was an advisor, he is an advisor to Air Quality Asia, and there's a huge lot of list. So, firstly, welcome to the 18th session of the Learners Republic Policy Fellowship, sir. Um, if you can't tell already, I see you smile, but I am a fan. You had a talk scheduled once at LUMS, and uski sign-up list bilkul full ho gayi thi. So I volunteered to be the person who changes the slide. So I went to the organizers and I said, मैं वो slides change करूँगी. So the speaker before you had 100 slides, unfortunately, but it was a pleasure listening to you then, and I look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And thank you so much, Learners Republic, for not only inviting me, but putting together this fantastically exciting initiative and fellowship. Assalamu alaikum, Naveed Saab, for organizing this and allowing me to participate. Thank you for the team for also organizing this. May I be allowed to share my screen? Yes. I wanted to speak about environment policy and focus a bit on air pollution and water. But before I did that, I wanted to speak a little bit about the law and the structuring of policy and who's responsible for it, because I think this is important. And I know that Omar Galani gave a fantastic lecture to you guys about the Constitution and law and policy. And I don't want to, actually I was in touch with him, but I don't want to overlap anything. What I briefly want to talk about is the issue of how subjects are governed in Pakistan. Who is responsible for policy, right? Kiski zimmedari? I know you have, for example, a ministry called the Ministry of Climate Change. But what are they really responsible for? And for example, seed quality is something that's an issue in agriculture because agricultural output depends on it. But who is responsible for seed quality? Is it the federal government? Is it the provincial government? Is it local government? I mean, whose throat can you choke in terms of assigning specifically the responsibility of policy? And for this, I have just a couple of references to the Constitution. The first one here is Article 142 of our Constitution, which talks about the subject matter, of federal and provincial laws. So this gives you your basic understanding of who's responsible for lawmaking where, right? Who's responsible for governance? So it says here that Parliament, Majlis-e-Shura, Parliament is the National Assembly in Islamabad, shall have the exclusive power to make laws with respect to any matter in the federal legislative list. All right, so I have here the federal legislative list of the Constitution. You can find this online. You just have to type in Constitution. And it has a list of about 70 subjects divided into Part A and Part B that identify what the responsibilities of the federal government and Parliament are. What can Parliament make law on is what the federal government's responsibilities are. So the two things are connected. So Wafaki Hukumat or Parliament ki Qanun Sazi or policy making domain jo hai, comes from this list. So the defense of the federation, number one. Number two, the military. Number three, external affairs. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. All right? And I'll leave it to you to have a look at this list. And what I would challenge you to do is try and find things that aren't on the list that the federal government is doing. So for example, you might have heard about the plan the federal government has to develop islands just outside Karachi, the Bandul and Buddhu Islands, and that the president of Pakistan, acting on behalf of the federation, passed a law for the development of these islands. So I'll challenge you, for example, to find in this legislative list the responsibility of islands and see if it's on the list. Because if it isn't on the list, it's not their responsibility, because the Constitution says Parliament shall have exclusive power to make laws with any matter on the federal list. Then it says Parliament and provincial assemblies shall have powers to make laws with respect to criminal law, criminal procedure and evidence, and that a provincial assembly shall and Parliament shall not have power to make laws with respect to matters not in the federal list. So very simply, if you want to know whose responsibility it is, whether it's the federal governments or the provincial governments, you just have to look at the federal list. If it's not on the federal list, it's a provincial responsibility. It's that simple. Now, within this, the federal government and the provincial governments have been given the authority by the Constitution to distribute and assign the responsibilities of governance amongst various departments. For example, you've got 30 things to govern over: Navy, foreign trade, so on and so forth. तो इनके लिए महकमे बनाने वाले जो जिम्मेदारी है, जो rules हैं, those are made by Parliament and by the provincial assemblies to regulate business of the provincial government and the federal government. Here's a copy of the Rules of Business, the Federal Government Rules of Business of 1973. You can find this online, as I have as well. Okay, and what's interesting, and I'll come to this in a second in my presentation, but very simple. Let's find out what the climate change responsibilities of the government are, of the federal government. So here, in the federal list, in the federal government rules of business, every ministry of the federal government is assigned responsibilities. It's kind of like a terms of reference for every single ministry. And this is the responsibility of the, इससे ज़्यादा ministry का काम ही नहीं. So यहाँ आप देखेंगे climate change division, जो climate change ministry है, इनकी ये 9 ज़िम्मेदारियां हैं. They have 9 responsibilities. That's it. And you can contrast this, for example, with the finance division. Oh, finance is going to be a bit, I'll come to it in just a second. Sorry, I should have, here we are, finance division. And you'll notice, I don't want to go into detail, finance division ki 30 zimmedariyan. So every department, so if you can find out whether it's the federal government or the provincial government is a reference to the federal list. Here you know it's the federal government's responsibility or the provincial government's responsibility. And if you want to find out kis mehkme ki zimmedari hai, you have to look at the rules of business. And they tell you which department at the provincial level and which ministry at the federal is responsible for what. Okay? And so, for example, if you want to find stuff out about seeds, you can go to the Ministry of Food Security and Research, and you can look under its terms of reference, and they're the people responsible, for example, for seed quality. And that's how you could pinpoint and identify policies and who's responsible for them. With that sort of preface, let me get into my presentation on environmental management. And wait for my computer. So where do we get our environmental sort of principles from? What is the environment? What is it that we're protecting? And then what are some of the issues that are, or legal issues in setting up environmental regulation? And I'll try and do this with illustrations from water and air pollution. Plus I'll try and push some policy boundaries as well. But let's start off with asking this question of, what is the environment? Mahal kya hai? A lot of people think that planting trees is the silver bullet for the environment. But, the environment is much broader than that. It's also clean rivers, clean drinking water, a healthy and diverse ecology, a good healthy forest cover, and so on and so forth. The environment is a number of things. And herein actually lies the problem. I mean, we've got laws relating to forests that go back till pre-partition. We have laws relating to wildlife that go back till pre-partition. We even have laws in our penal code regarding nuisance, the littering and so on and so forth. But we never really had a sort of integrated environmental law at all. And so it wasn't until the effects of industrial pollution started being felt in Pakistan, or places in Pakistan, that we needed to respond with a sort of comprehensive environmental legislation rather than having these specific sectors by law. And this is, for example, climate change is so intersectoral that it sort of makes you wonder how you can even make a law about it. But as the subject of environment becomes wider and wider, once you make it integrated, the question is, who is then responsible for environmental management, right? Industrial pollution, agar aapne control karni hai, then you need to have inspectors where the factories are. But if you want to ensure that there is clean water available to everyone, you need to have people, inspectors all over the province where people drink water. If you want to, for example, check the amount or check the pollution from pesticides as a result of agriculture, you need to have a field formation which is tens of thousands strong. If you want to check water quality in Pakistan, you have to have people everywhere checking underground. And each one of these, as your concept of environment becomes wider, you'll note that the regulatory capacity, the number of people you need to protect the environment becomes more and more, and their specializations become greater and greater, and it becomes more and more expensive. So that's a sort of paradox in environmental regulation. As we sort of unfold environmental regulation and as it starts applying to more and more facets of our lives, it becomes much more difficult a management and regulatory challenge because of these issues. Who can do the monitoring then? And certainly who pays for the environment to be cleaned up? These are also questions to be asked. I know that there's an environmental law principle that says that the polluter must pay. And that's the responsibility of the polluter to pay for the rehabilitation to the environment resulting from the damage that they cause. They're responsible financially. And while this makes sense, and it might not in a place like Pakistan or indeed many third world countries, simply because of the fact that now in Pakistan, if you look at the industrial sector, most of the industry in Pakistan, like 90% or over 90%, are small and medium enterprises. Ab in logon ke paas na wo wasail hai, na wo zameen hai to put up waste treatment plants or to put up the air filters necessary to pay for the pollution. तो इस तरह के socio-economic demographic में जब लोग गरीब हैं, उनसे आप कितना polluter pays principle चलाएंगे? And this is another one of those paradoxical questions in Pakistani, the enforcement of Pakistani environmental law. Oops. Why is it doing this? All right. Let me launch into a bit of a history as to where we got our environmental principles. It goes back all the way to 1972 when the United Nations hosted the first international conference on environmental law. And Pakistan went, it was participating in it. It signed on to what became the Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment. And it was a result of that. In 1972-73 is when Pakistan was writing its new constitution. So as a result of its participation at the Stockholm Conference, there was a change in the federal government rules of business, and an environment and urban affairs division was actually introduced into the Ministry of Housing and Works. And that's where we get our first sort of environmental sub-ministry, so to speak. अब मैं आपको एक मजेदार बात बताऊं कि it was while this division was part of the Ministry of Housing and Works that its service rules were created, the service rules of who are the people who are going to staff this division. And उस वक्त के दौर के अंदर, because it was Ministry of Housing and Works, certain decisions were made about who was going to sit and what type of officers were needed, the organogram, so to speak, the Environment Division. Ab chalte chalte going forward, the Environment Division eventually became an Environment Ministry in 1979. And then after the 18th Amendment, it became the Ministry of Climate Change. But मजेदार बात ये कि service rules उस ज़माने के आज तक बने हुए, which means that Director General Climate Change today, who used to be the Director General Environment before the 18th Amendment and was the Director General, his educational qualifications are a PhD in urban planning. Nothing to do with the environment and nothing to do with climate change. As a matter of fact, most of the officers in the Ministry of Environment are actually architects and draftsmen, because that was the requirement of the Ministry of Housing and Works back in the 1970s. And so, jitne अच्छे लोग आपको इस आजकल ministry के अंदर मिलेंगे, their backgrounds, their educational qualifications don't actually equip them for the job. Anyway, in 1983, we passed our first law, the Pakistan Environment Protection Ordinance, which set up the basic framework of what we know to be environment law now. And in the late 1980s, we got involved with this IUCN, this international NGO, and their project on conservation strategies. Pakistan became one of the first developing countries to undertake a full national conservation strategy, which it published in 1992. But the exercise itself, which was carried out by the Planning Commission and the Ministry of Environment, meant that there were so many people involved in analyzing environment in Pakistan that we became, I mean, as a country, we had so much capacity that when we went to attend the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio in 1992, the Pakistani delegation was voted to represent the G77 bloc of countries under Ambassador Jamshed Markar, who then negotiated the treaty, because that was the level of capacity that had been developed by the Planning Commission. And people like Adil Najam worked on the National Conservation Strategy. Abran Kabraji, who now runs IUCN, worked on the conservation strategy. Ayub Qutb worked on the conservation strategy. So the fathers and the grandparents of environmental policy of Pakistan come from this conservation strategy, which led to a huge capacity in the federal government in the early 1990s, which momentum was then even pushed forward by a Supreme Court case called the Shaila Zia versus Wabda case, which recognized environmental rights as part of the fundamental right to life. And this really opened the writ jurisdiction. The public interest litigation on environmental law was as a result of this case, because now the High Court or the Supreme Court recognized that fundamental rights were now involved. So you could always go to court when you needed to. And all of this momentum led to the passing of the Pakistan Environment Protection Act in 1997, which seeks to protect, preserve, and rehabilitate the environment, and also introduce principles of sustainable development. So it really is a synthesis. It's a law that synthesizes the developments that took place in the preceding decade or so. That said, this remarkable momentum that had been created through the 1990s was more or less brought to a halt with the martial law 1999. Because at that point also Pakistan entered into an IMF program, which meant that a lot of its development projects had to be shelved in favor of the IMF program that was going forward. Nevertheless, in 2001, we came up with a National Environment Action Plan. 2005, we had a federal environment policy. But these federal initiatives were, you could say, rendered short by the passing of the 18th Amendment, which took the subject of natural pollution and ecology, which was once a shared responsibility with the federation and the provinces. Well, federalist wali baat aa jati. It took the subject of environment and assigned it specifically to the provincial governments or to the provinces. So now the federation, because it's no longer responsible for environmental regulation or natural ecology, can't make any laws with respect to the subject, nor can it enforce any policy. So a lot of the policies that were in the past, the National Environment Policy, the Action Plan, rendered useless because the federal government is no longer responsible for enforcing them. उसके सवाल पूछता है कि Pakistan Environment Protection Act का क्या बना? It's still on the law books, but believe it or not, the Pakistan Environment Protection Act is enforceable only to the Ahmad Capital Territory. because that's what's left of Pakistan, of the scope of the law after the 18th Amendment. Nevertheless, after the 18th Amendment, Pakistan has even passed the National Climate Change Policy of 2012. Now, while it's remarkable that a developing country actually has a national policy on climate change, I will point out that if you look at the fourth schedule or the federal legislative list of the Constitution, and you look for the words climate change, you will find that they do not exist on the list. Climate change is not a responsibility of the federal government. Yet, this is just experience. We have a national policy on climate change. And perhaps one of the reasons why this national policy isn't going forward is because really the constitutional responsibility of having climate policy now rests with the provinces. And really, this exists on paper alone and doesn't really have the legal authority for it to gain momentum and traction. Nevertheless, the 4 provinces have passed their own environment laws since the 18th Amendment. So each province has its own Environment Act. They're broadly similar. So, there's not much difference between them and the Pakistan Environment Protection Act. Dhancha sara ek hi hai, takriban. Or 2016 mein we became one of the few countries on earth actually to pass national climate change legislation. So there's a National Climate Change Act from 2016. वही सवाल बनता है, does Parliament have the power to make this act? I don't know. I don't think so. मगर उन्होंने बना तो लिया. But maybe my question is regarding the Federation's ability to pass a law. Perhaps that provides an answer to why this law hasn't been operationalized in the last 4 years. कानून तो बना दिया, मगर चूंकि वफाक की अब जिम्मेदारी नहीं रही, it's not really being taken forward at all. With this sort of policy background in mind, let me just also say that as far as environmental rights are concerned, we not only have federal government policy and legislation and laws and so on and so forth, but real support from the judicial system. The Pakistani judiciary has been supportive of recognizing environmental rights and then enforcing them. So I'd mentioned the Shaila Zia case, where in 1994, Justice Salim Akhtar recognized that the right to a clean and healthy environment was part of the fundamental right to life. And, this judgment gives lawyers like me things to do and gainful. But beyond that, there's the salt miners case. Again, the Salim Akhtar in 1994. This was the Cura salt miners case, which held that clean drinking water is also a fundamental right. Mind you, clean drinking water is not a fundamental right. And there's a difference between water being a fundamental right and drinking water being a fundamental right. If you make water a fundamental right, फिर agricultural practices पे भी सवाल उठने शुरू हो जाएंगे कि यार अगर पानी की कमी है और सालों का हक है, तो फिर आप गन्ना South Punjab में और water stressed areas में क्यों लगा रहे हैं? And no one wants to get into that debate, which is why the fundamental right to water is restricted to drinking water so far around the world. And interestingly, this Cura salt miners case was exactly the same case that was revived by Saqib Nisar in 2018 when it was reported that the Katas Raj temple complex water supply had been disrupted by the cement plants close by. So this case still persists, believe it or not. We have the Pakistan Chest Foundation case from 1997. अगर आप लोगों को याद हो, way back when, before 1997, PTV पे cigarette के ads आते थे. There used to be tobacco ads on television. And this case held that because it is proved that tobacco is injurious to health, and because protecting the environment is a fundamental right, but a fundamental right like no other. Because most fundamental rights, the right to liberty can only be exercised if you are detained. The right to free speech can only be sort of supported if your right is being challenged. So in almost all the other fundamental rights, the state's responsibility arises when the right is violated or threatened. But you can't do that with the fundamental right to life. If you take someone's life away, you can't revive it back. And so there is a completely different obligation on the state when it comes to protecting the right to life. It can't sit back and wait for the right to be threatened or challenged. It has to positively enforce the right. So it has to keep a vigilant eye to ensure that the right is constantly protected. And if that is the case, Pakistan Television, being a state-run authority, cannot advertise something that is known to be bad and injurious to health. Pakistan Chest Foundation case. We have the Canal Road widening case of about a decade ago, which involved the cutting down of trees to widen a road in Lahore, which resulted in the recognition of the doctrine of public trust, which is a very powerful environmental doctrine that says that all natural resources in Pakistan belong in trust to the state, and the state can consume these resources, but only for the benefit of Pakistanis and not for any corporate or private interests. It's a very powerful principle that has been used in cases such as about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a challenge to the conversion of a park in Islamabad to a mini golf park. Doctrine of public trust was invoked and the park remains a park. To the sublime, where this doctrine was actually used in the Rico Dick case to invalidate the concessions and the licenses the government of Balochistan had given to the Tethian mining company. So it's a very powerful doctrine of environmental law recognized in Pakistan. In 2015, the Lahore High Court, Justice Mansoor Ali Shah in the Asghar Lagari case, not just recognizing the fundamental right to a clean and healthy environment, pushed the envelope even further and said that climate change justice is now the fundamental right of all Pakistanis to have, because climate change impacts our resources and our right to life very clearly. Our ability to lead healthy and fulfilling lives is threatened by climate change. And so Justice Mansoor Ali Shah weaves in the constitution and says that climate change is something that the state has to be on the guard for. And not just that, most recently, the Orange Line case. This is the construction of the train in Lahore. And whilst much has been written about the preservation of historical monuments, and indeed the train is running, there is an operative part of the Lahore High Court decision that recognizes the right to, well, that recognizes that cultural heritage, built cultural heritage, is part of everyone's fundamental right to life, which is incredibly important, especially in the Islamic Republic of Lahore, where we understand that this city has been, mashallah, under Islam since the beginning of time. Not forgetting that less than 100 years ago, this was a diverse, mixed population. And so these built reminders of other cultures connect all of us to a history that enriches us and merits to be protected just as well as the fundamental right to life. And so you can see how the courts have not just protected fundamental rights, but environmental rights, but they have pushed the envelope out and further out, recognizing new types of environmental rights, creating new jurisprudence. And while, for example, the Asghar Lagari case and the Orange Line case are only a few years old, there is still time for developments in these areas for a better understanding and expanding even on these principles. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. What do the EPAs do under the law? The EPAs, the Environment Protection Agencies of the 4 provinces, and the Environment Protection Agency for the Islamabad Capital Territory all have the same regulatory ambit. They are to enforce something called environmental quality standards. PEQS, Pakistan Environment Quality Standards, or Sindh Environment Quality Standards. These are quality standards for things like water, air, noise, and other types of pollution that set limits of how much pollution can be carried out in that sector. So noise pollution, for example, you can't run a machine that is in excess of 55 decibels in a residential area in Lahore after business hours, for example. And similarly, you cannot discharge more than a certain amount of sulfur dioxide when you are producing energy from coal-fired processes. There are limits under each one of these standards. And this is the important sort of enforcement that the environment protection agencies are supposed to do. The second thing they do is that they approve projects. All projects, good or bad, cause environment impact. Even my breathing, frankly, converts oxygen to carbon monoxide. So all activities have some manner of environmental impact, and environment protection agencies are responsible for screening projects and making sure that all projects understand their environmental impact and take the necessary steps to mitigate that damage through a process called the environmental approval process. So you have to get these documents called the initial environmental examination or the environment impact assessment prepared and approved. But this is the mechanism by which the Environment Protection Agency ensures things such as sustainable development. It makes sure that any project that comes along will take measures to reduce its pollution footprint, and also take measures for rehabilitation. So for example, one common requirement of environmental approval is planting trees. Almost every project that's approved by the Environment Protection Agencies is required to plant, in many cases, thousands and thousands of trees. And this is a consistent practice. The environmental laws also prohibit the import of hazardous wastes into Pakistan, and they also regulate the handling of hazardous substances within Pakistan. It also regulates motor vehicles. Now, I have two of these in green because although the Environment Protection Agencies are responsible for regulating hazardous substances and automobiles, they don't actually do so. So for example, in Lahore, when we know that so much air pollution is caused by cars, although the Environment Protection Agency has the ability to regulate fuel quality and automobile emissions, we find that to date they haven't done so. And in their implementing or trying to do something about smog and air pollution, they are instead clamping down on brick kilns and on crop burning. So they're not exercising these regulatory areas, and not just in the case of Punjab, but also in the case of KP and Balochistan as well. When I speak to people from the EPA as to why they don't regulate automobiles, I'm told that मिल मिलाकर EPA पंजाब में 700 लोग हैं और गाड़ियां लाहौर के अंदर तकरीबन 10 लाख हैं. तो खुद ही हिसाब लगा लें, there's no way this staff can regulate that level of automobile unless you give them special capacity. You know, it goes back to that question of what is the environment? And the more and more of the environment you want to regulate, the more people you need and the more expensive it gets. Then the EPA has these powers to pass environment protection orders, which is their sort of ability to reach out and stop you from doing something. So if the EPA at any stage finds that you are doing something that's adverse to the environment, they can issue an order asking you to stop doing that, install replacement technology, or to remove the pollutant that you've already discharged. And this is a very frequent order that's passed against polluting industries throughout the country. I have here, yes, these are two slides of the rules of business for the federal government on the left, Punjab on the right. So I'm showing you here, you know, the government of Punjab, not the EPA, but the federal government and the government of Punjab's mandate to regulate the environment. So focus here on the Punjab for a second. There are 7 matters listed. So they're responsible for planning and policy making for environment and ecology. They are to administer the Environment Protection Agency. They are to do budget and accounts. They are to purchase stores, service matters, promotion, transfers. So ये 3 चीजें आप निकाल ही दें, 3, 4, and 5 are administrative matters. They have nothing to do with environment. And then they are to enforce ये 2 कानून, Environment Protection Act and ये plastic bags का कानून. So when you look at it, the government of Punjab, EPD, has only 1, 2, 3, 4 responsibilities. And they're not very wide. Climate change is not a responsibility. It's not on the list. So if you go to the EPD and talk to them about climate change, वो जवाब देंगे, but formally, legally, they're not actually assigned the responsibility. And now you can look at Sindh, and Sindh is amusing because Sindh changed the name of its department, its environment department, in 2016 and changed the name to Environment, Climate Change and Coastal Development. So it has 4 responsibilities. And I mean, it's a climate change department in name only, because it doesn't elaborate what the responsibilities are. It's a very broad responsibility. और इधर बलूचिस्तान में आप देखेंगे कि rules of business के अंदर इन्होंने 3 महकमों को इकट्ठा कर दिया है: environment, sports and youth. If you go to KP, by any chance, KP ने forests और environment को इकट्ठा कर दिया. Incidentally, KP has the most amount of forest cover. So a lot of environmental protection for them is protecting forests. So forest and environment is connected. Punjab में industry ज़्यादा है, so वो forest से हटा दी गई है, and Environment Protection Department is specifically responsible for enforcing the Environment Protection Act. So you'll see that each province has its own ability to widen or refine its own governance of a subject. And I will submit that having a look at how these are structured in practice actually leaves a very narrow scope of environmental governance. I think these can be much better written and much more elaborate to give far more clear responsibilities to these departments as to what they're responsible for. अच्छा जी, ये हमने कानून और महकमी जिम्मेदारियां समझ ली हैं. Let me speak a little bit about water pollution, which is a major health issue in Pakistan. And let me illustrate it with these 2 images. The image on the left is a World Bank nighttime satellite photograph composite of Pakistan, which illustrates, for those who are interested, the urban intensity of Pakistan. रात को जहां बत्तियां हैं वहां आबादी है, ergo that is where your settlements are. So it's a good visualization of where population in Pakistan is. And the picture on the right was published by Scientific American in 2017 in concluding a 3-year study of almost every water body, river, groundwater aquifers, throughout Pakistan for arsenic. Now, arsenic is a naturally occurring chemical compound found in groundwater. And this study reported that nearly 2/3 of Pakistan, or Pakistanis, are exposed to unhealthy amounts of arsenic. And the intensity of that arsenic they've measured in this map over here, and the red dots show high levels of arsenic contamination in groundwater or drinking water. And what's startling is that the 2 maps, or these 2 images, are almost exactly the same. And so that's why, it said that so many Pakistanis are susceptible to water contamination, arsenic being one example. But the thing about arsenic is that, with filtration, it can be removed. It is lethal. Arsenic will kill you. It will age you prematurely. But you can remove it through filtration. Another type of water pollution, which is not natural, is man-made or human-induced water pollution. So effluents from industry or domestic effluent from residential areas are allowed into water bodies and then subsequently used for irrigation, resulting again in the passing of disease. UNICEF reported about 10 years ago that nearly 40% of all Pakistanis in hospitals are there because of some sort of water-related ailment. And a lot of this has to do with the contamination that we're seeing by unadulterated or unchecked water pollution by industry. This is a recent report, the 1st of January 2021, where the Pakistan Medical Association has said that over 200 million Pakistanis don't have access to clean drinking water. 2/3 of the population. So this is a major public health issue, right? And you wonder whether the regulatory and legal abilities of the Environment Protection Departments are sufficient for an issue of that scale, of this scale. But not just drinking water quality. Let me then also divert your attention to transboundary water. Now, transboundary water की जब बात करते हैं, ज़्यादातर we talk about the Indus Water Treaty, which is the legal document sharing the waters of the Indus Basin between India and Pakistan. But please understand, the Indus Water Treaty is with respect to the rivers which flow on the surface of the earth. It's a surface water document. The Indus Treaty does not speak of groundwater or groundwater usage and how groundwater, which is the Indus Basin aquifer, this aquifer that traverses the subcontinent, how that's to be shared. And more research, recent research, especially satellite-based research, जो कि 30-40 साल पहले थी ही नहीं, अब नासा और मुख्तलिफ और इदारों की जो satellite-based research है, उससे अब मालूम हो रहा है कि groundwater aquifer across the border is being affected. Let me see if I can get this video to work for you. This is a NASA GRACE satellite time lapse of about 8 or 10 years of groundwater extraction in the North Indian aquifer. And what's clear, and North India, Indian Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan are irrigation states. There's a lot of groundwater that's used there. And so it's clear that usage of groundwater on both sides of the border is impacting groundwater on both sides. But because there is no proper study on this, we don't know to what extent the aquifer is being sort of affected one way or the other. Okay. Let me quickly, seems like an easy slide, but I want to make a point about water. I have now spoken about this. I just want to make another point about policy and water, which has to do with the water cycle. We're all familiar with the water cycle. This is what we study in school. The fundamental point from this slide is that water exists in three forms, either as a liquid or as a gas or as a solid when it's frozen. And it's either in the sky, it's on the ground, or it's underground. And that's it. That's the water cycle. And water doesn't leave this system. There's no H2O that has come into Earth ever since the Earth formed. And there's no H2O that's leaving the planet either. It's either ice, it's either water, or it's either gas, vapor. And it's either in the sky, on the ground, or underwater, underground. That's it. The system is, that's the closed loop. And we also know from the water cycle, we also know that most water on Earth is found on the surface of the Earth. That seems clear enough as well, but you have to understand that the surface of the Earth is a very thin film of water. It's not very deep. And so if you were to take all of the water in the oceans of the world and ball it up, volumetrically, that's what it looks like. That's all the water that's on the surface of the Earth, either as ice, as water, or in vapor. That's it. That's all the water on Earth. And it's either in the sky, in the ground, or underwater. And you can refine this into this. And this really crystallizes just how precious a resource water is, and how contaminating something that's so scarce is quite scary, because that's all the water we have. And it really casts a heavy responsibility on us, that doctrine of public trust, not to consume this resource in a way that's wasteful at all. But speaking of waste, when people speak to me about what they can do in terms of conserving water, quite often they talk about how they'll turn the taps off when they're brushing their teeth. But that's one way of looking at how you can save water. Water is a precious commodity. I'll invite your attention to something called virtual water, which is a very back of the envelope, very blunt policy exercise of converting how much water it takes to produce certain commodities. So coffee, for example, the coffee tree, the coffee plant is a very thirsty plant. It requires a lot of water to grow and to harvest. And if you calculate all the water required by a tree to grow and give harvest for a kilo of coffee, it comes to something close to 19,000 liters of water for a kilo of coffee. And I can assure you that the room I'm sitting in is too small for 19,000 liters of water. And similarly, beef, which is number 3 on the list. Raising the animal, feeding the animal, giving it water, keeping it clean, takes a lot of water. And it's been calculated that about a kilo, 4 logon ki kadhai, is 1,400, nearly 15,000 liters of water. This is a really interesting exercise when you convert these things, because this really points to our consumerism as the real driver of environmental damage. If we're talking about water scarcity and we're trying to be responsible, do we have to have coffee all the time? Do we have to have meat all the time? Do we have to have cotton, for example, all the time? Cotton takes a lot of water as well, and so on. While that's one question, and indeed a profound one, there's another one as well. Come lower down on the list. Beer and potatoes are at the bottom of the list. I wonder what that means. But no, it's things like corn and barley and wheat, which you'll find at the bottom third of the list, your basic grains. And these are foods that are available to the poor, the people in poverty, people who can't afford a single meal a day. That's what the poverty line is. It's to be able to feed yourself once a day. What we find is people who struggle to feed themselves once a day, people under the poverty line, don't have very good diets. They're relying on lentils and grains basically. But what we find is as incomes increase, as livelihoods prosper, diets change, and people introduce things like milk into their diets. They introduce things like yogurt into their diet. Eventually they'll introduce fruits, and going up the chain, they'll introduce meats. And the contradiction, the paradox here is that if we are successful in our economic policies to make Pakistan a wealthy nation, or at least a prosperous nation, unless we change our consumptive habits, our affluence is going to come at an incredible cost of water, especially virtual water, because of our consumptive habits. And this is something we need to keep into check. Not everyone, going into the future, and mark my words, going into the future, not everyone will have the luxury of eating beef. Amongst even us, it's going to become a prohibitive luxury. As it is chocolate is becoming increasingly scarce, which is why all these substitutes now plague the market. Chocolate will become something that will be hyper expensive in the next 15 years, by the way. Sorry, but that's the truth. So with these policy aspects of water, one more thing about water and policy. This is a map of water imports, showing nations that are importing water into them. And what we mean by these imports is virtual water. So you'll see from India and Pakistan, a huge amount of water going into Europe. This is our cotton industry. A lot of cotton is exported into Europe because it's a huge market. You'll see an arrow from South America into Europe. And I would guess that that's the coffee and chocolate from South America that's going there. So this is a map showing you how nations trade water. And this is really interesting because this will illustrate questions such as if Pakistan is a water scarce country, and we're told Pakistan is a water scarce country, and rice takes nearly 2,000 liters of water to produce a kilo of rice. Should a water scarce country like Pakistan be packaging water into this grain of rice? Rice is nothing but tightly packaged water. Should we be exporting water in the form of rice, say to Australia, where basmati will sit on the shelf next to Tex-Mex rice, and someone in Australia won't care what the difference is? Should Pakistan be exporting food grains to African countries or countries that are in stress, that need relief, when itself is a water scarce country? These are policy questions regarding environment and water that really no one has started looking at, let alone answering. And I wanted to bring it to your attention because it's really at the outskirts of the policy discussion on water nowadays. And it goes back to that question of water not being a fundamental right. Because if all water was a fundamental right, फिर इस तरह के trade issues पे आप सवाल उठा सकते थे. But so far, only drinking water is a fundamental right. So you can only claim your fundamental right to the extent of having access to a sufficient supply of adequate drinking water. These are some policy issues on water. Let me show you some interesting policy issues in relation to air quality. It's a picture of Lahore, by the way, 2 years ago, and it's air pollution. It is really bad air pollution.
Oh, yeah.
This is a photograph or a
Fantastic.
slide that was given to me by Dr. Arvind Kumar of the Lung Care Foundation in Delhi. He's a heart surgeon in the Gangaram Hospital in New Delhi. And when I met him 2 years ago at a WHO conference, he reminded me firstly that the original Gangaram Hospital is in Lahore. But then told me this tragic story of how this 28-year-old patient, that's her lung on the right, was admitted into hospital and eventually perished because she had lung cancer, even though there was no incident of cancer in her family and she was a non-smoker. What Dr. Kumar told me was that when he started practice about 30 years ago, patients who patients who had cancer were mostly men and mostly smokers or with a history of cancer in the family. But that 30 years down the line, today, he finds that his lung cancer patients are equally divided, male and female, equally divided, smokers and non-smokers. But the point Dr. Kumar makes is that because the air quality in Delhi is so bad, everyone in Delhi can be considered to be a smoker unless you take adequate precautions. It really is a public health issue. And although Pakistan doesn't have much information, there are a couple of studies that have been conducted. This one by the Children's Hospital in Lahore. I didn't realize it was one of the largest children's hospitals in the world. But their very basic back of the envelope calculations, again, show that there has been a tripling of children admitted with chest ailments in the last 10 years. And that most of the admissions, these are admissions for pneumonia and bronchitis, which are again chest-related ailments, that incidence of these chest-related ailments spike. You'll notice here October, November, December, January, the winter months or the smog season, as it were. So it's very clear that this is a public health issue. And it is bad, it is serious. There is no such thing as a safe amount of air pollution. Let's come here. Now, normally, these are pictures of, this is a NASA satellite imagery of temperature anomalies over South Asia. And it's used to illustrate crop burning in North India. So the picture on the left is the 3rd of November, 2017, where you can see all the red dots are concentrated in India. And that's the crop burning that we blame them for. But they're not the only people who do crop burning. The rice crop rotation happens in Pakistan as well. And the same satellite from 3 weeks later shows that the majority of crop burning is taking place in Pakistan. उनकी बासमती और हमारी बासमती में थोड़ा सा फर्क है. There's क्या कहते हैं, harvests a few weeks earlier than ours. But you know, the fact that India, or the thought that India is somehow, or this crop burning from India is responsible for air pollution is more or less conclusively shown to be wrong because of weather patterns. This time of year, we don't have the monsoons. We have something called westerly winds that come from Central Asia and blow wind out into the Arabian Sea and into the Gulf, Bay of Bengal. So, you know, most of the time, hawa unki taraf jari hoti. You can't really argue ki hawa is taraf aa rahi hai. So this idea that their farmers are doing it's a fantasy. And plus, blaming other people for problems is no way of trying to go about solving them either. This is another slide, but you know, the crop burning doesn't just take place in October. Crop burning also takes place in April, May, when there's the rotation for the wheat crop and to plant the rice crop. So the picture on the top left over here is actually from the 9th of May, 2018. It's a few years old, but it's very clear that crop burning is taking place throughout North India. And on that day, there was incredibly bad air pollution throughout Punjab, Pakistani Punjab and North India. But because you couldn't see it, no one complained. It isn't like the air pollution in the winter, which jab aapko nazar aata hai behtar. But you know, this happens most and throughout the year. What's happened in terms of air pollution in Punjab has been that 2016 May, there was a smog event. And it's like 4 years ago, everyone went nuts. You couldn't see 20 feet. All of a sudden, there was a smog event. And the High Court took notice, the Lahore High Court took suo motu notice. It told the government of Punjab to come up with a policy, which by 2017, jab dusra smog hua, the government of Punjab came up with a smog policy. And the smog policy addressed fuel quality, it addressed industrial emissions, it addressed a host of things that I'll just tell you in just a second. स्मॉग पॉलिसी जब तैयार हुई तो लाहौर हाई कोर्ट को पसंद नहीं आई, तो the High Court passed something called the Smog Health Emergency Action Plan, which is a sort of policy document, sometimes called SHEEP, but formed the Smog Commission. So Lahore High Court didn't like the smog policy. Usko side pe rakho, we'll have the health action plan, and we'll form a smog commission to look at the sources of smog and sustainable solutions for smog. तो स्मॉग कमीशन का काम शुरू हो गया 2018 में दोबारा, थर्ड टाइम देयर वाज अ स्मॉग इवेंट. उतने में सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने नोटिस ले लिया, and the smog commission finalized its recommendations and took it to the Supreme Court. And this all resulted in the Punjab Action Plan. So the major suggestions of all of this policy action in the first 3 years of smog was to focus on low sulfur fuels that improve the fuel quality in Pakistan, because the petrol quality here is some of the worst in the world, by the way. To adopt Euro 2 standards for fuel, to again install catalytic converters for cars, to start controlling crop dust, to start improving the capacity to monitor air pollution, and so on and so forth. There are about 17 different options that's been identified. But air pollution policy karne ke liye, you really have to understand where air pollution comes from. So to better understand the sort of recommendations of the commission and the action plan, it's really helpful to look at this agriculture department report that was prepared with the WHO, which conducts what's called a source apportionment exercise, where they identify the causes or the sources of air pollution. And whilst this is a very good report, it's about 2 years old, and it was carried out only in 11 of Punjab's 36 districts. And there's room for improvement, but it does point out that a majority of air pollution across the year-long air pollution in Punjab comes from the transport sector. And if it isn't some of the dirtiest fuel in the world, it's the 40-year-old Bedford engines that go up and down GT Road in the motorway that are, the main source of air pollution. और उसके बाद फिर industrial emissions आती हैं, because industry के अंदर कोयला जलता है, industry के अंदर all sorts of fuels, and then some industries actually burn pollutants such as rubber and other wastes to generate energy as well. The power sector is a huge pollutant in Punjab. There's so much electricity that's made out of coal and from diesel, and that's a massive air polluter as well. And then the remaining last 20% is things like crop burning and other miscellaneous. There's construction dust. There are other types of smaller types of pollution as well. But your majority issue is with transport. And so, you look at this pie chart and you look at the reporting on air quality in Punjab in the last 3 weeks. And जो enforcement हो रही है, वो सिर्फ crop burning पे हो रही है और ये भट्टों पे हो रही है. And you look, you have to ask yourself, is this policy, does this enforcement make sense? When you know that the major cause of pollution is the transport sector and, say, energy, why are you going after stuff that's, smaller on the scale? Because the thing with crop burning is that it's not a year-long phenomenon. Pura saal log crop nahi jalate. It's only twice a year when there's crop rotation. It's the October-November period and then the April-May period. So why are we focusing all of our sort of enforcement energies on things that are not going to result or yield better results? That's one major policy question. Another problem that's happening with trying to get public or public sector or the government to respond to air quality has to do with their measurement of air pollution, which is another big issue. Because we have here, these are our environment quality standards for ambient air, which is the quality of air outside. And this chart, it's the law in Punjab कि sulfur कितना होना चाहिए, what's the maximum amount of the suspended particulate matter, what's the maximum amount of ozone you can have in the air. So this is your chart. That's what the law is, right? And along with the maximum allowable amounts of these types of pollutants for outside air, the column on the right identifies the type of monitoring that has to be conducted, the method of measurement, so to speak, that has to be carried out for each one of these pollutants. तो यहाँ मसला ये पड़ता है कि ये अल्ट्रा वायलेट फ्लोरेसेंस मेथड से अगर आप सल्फर डाइऑक्साइड निकाल रहे हैं और ओजोन आप नॉन डिस्पर्सिव यूवी अब्जॉर्प्शन मेथड से निकाल रहे हैं, इन मशीनों को खरीदने के लिए जो पैसे लगते हैं, it's upwards $50,000 to buy a machine that will monitor all of these pollutants in the way that the law prescribes. तो सवाल ये उठता है कि if you want to know what air pollution is so that you can tell people what it is, I mean, it's the state's responsibility to protect the right to life. Should we have such expensive monitoring methods? Because that restricts the state's ability to buy more machines to monitor air pollution. That's another policy question that comes out of this. But here, just focus on this particular matter 2.5, which is very small particles of dust, small enough to be absorbed through the lung and into the blood, and so extremely dangerous depending on what type of matter they contain. And look at the limits that are prescribed. Your annual average, salana taur pe, we shouldn't have more than 15 microns of PM 2.5 per cubic meter in the air. And so a friend of mine had a look at the EPD's air quality monitor on Jail Road, and they ran the system from the 16th of November 2017 for a whole year till 2018. This is just PM 2.5 levels. And the orange horizontal bar is 15 micrograms, which is the annual average limit by law. That's a stark reminder that air pollution is a serious public health issue. It's not just a seasonal issue. पूरे साल चलता है. And so in many ways, the Environment Protection Department or the policy response to conceive of air pollution as a seasonal issue only in the winter months, caused mostly by crop burning or by the running of brick kilns, is not really looking at the problem holistically. You're only looking at a small part of the problem and trying to solve it. It won't actually, you won't actually be able to do so. When in reality, the thing is that meters have gotten so much better and cheaper that now you can go to Air Visual. People can buy their own machines. $200 की machine आती है, you can put it up. और अब लाहौर के अंदर 15 इस तरह की machines हैं, which can tell you PM 2.5 quality real time. So why should the government of Punjab insist on having a $50,000 machine and not trust any of the other machines that come on? I mean, there's a huge need for there to be a minimum amount of trust between civil society and government so that government can trust the information that civil society is providing to it rather than brush it under the table and pretend it doesn't exist. One last illustration on policy matters for air quality. This is a map prepared by Greenpeace of NO2 pollution, nitrogen dioxide, which is produced when you burn fossil fuels. So koila, diesel, and even crop burning to some extent, because you're burning carbon. And this is, the black dots are coal-fired power plants throughout South Asia. And the redder it is, the worse it is. This chart was prepared by Greenpeace between August and October 2018, so in the monsoon period and before the smog season. And it identified Lahore as being in the top 50 most NO2 polluted cities in the world at number 32. But you look at this, I zoomed in a bit. On the bottom right, you see Lahore, completely ensconced in red, mostly because Lahore is such a big industrial city and there's so many cars here. So you're going to find this sort of red pocket. But other things are interesting, like between Rawalpindi and Peshawar, this sort of channel is the GT road. And think of all those thousands of old diesel trucks on the GT road. But over here, in Pizu, in KP, why should Pizu in KP be a NO2 hotspot of all places? But that's because the lucky cement people have a coal-fired cement plant over there. And the same is true with Kohat, here south of Peshawar. That little blob over Kohat is the Kohat cement plant. It's coal-fired. And here in Miawali, just north of Miawali, is where the Maple Leaf people have a coal-fired cement plant. Over here near Faisalabad, the flying energy people have a furnace oil. And here in Jambar Balan, the Nishat mill runs a 220 megawatt furnace oil power plant. People have to realize that it's no longer about having $100,000 machines. Science has gotten so advanced that kids sitting on computers in California can tell you not just where the pollution is taking place, they can name who's doing it and show you their front door. मैंने तो नाम ले लिए. So Iske baad mein, how do you take the policy forward? Now the question is not machines or monitors. Now it is, how do you transform the transport sector? What do you do with the energy sector? These are expensive things. You know, petrol saaf karne ke liye hamari refineries ko upgrade hona padega. It costs $1 billion each to upgrade a refinery. There are 5 refineries. Do we have $5 billion? No, we don't. So that major chunk of air pollution, what are we going to do about it? Here, most recently, the government of Pakistan has passed the electric vehicle policy, which hopes to make Pakistan a regional hub for electric vehicle production, and thereby not just reducing Pakistan's dependency on foreign oil, which is also an outflow of dollars, but also improve air quality. That's the ambition of the policy. So, you know, fingers crossed. But इसमें मसला ये है कि इस पाकिस्तान में कोई हवा साफ करने के लिए गाड़ी नहीं खरीदता. They look at other things. And so it's an uphill challenge, but it's a very good policy. And it's a policy that seeks to leapfrog the challenge of converting the refineries, which is an expensive proposition because that's money Pakistan doesn't have. $5 billion is roughly the size of the IMF program. और उस पे सियासत इतनी चली थी, you can't expect, you know, नहीं होने वाला. And also, more recently, the government of Pakistan has also changed the fuel quality that's available. तो पहले पाकिस्तान में जो पेट्रोल आता था, was some of the filthiest in the world until the Kuwait refineries, from where we buy most of our automobile petroleum products, said कि भैया हम ये तेल आपको नहीं बेचते. They were actually ending the supply. And so we have recently upgraded to Euro 5 standard fuel, and which is now available in Pakistan, but not mandatory. It'll be a little bit more expensive, but it's not something that you are required to have in your car yet. It's only merely available. So hopefully with the rollout of these two policies, we can actually see a change in air pollution. And that is where I want to end my presentation. I know I've been yabbering along for an hour and like a fire hose, but I thought I'd stop here and answer some questions that I'm sure people have.
So thank you very much, sir. I really enjoyed that. Can't say the same for my abandoned cup of coffee. We will take questions. So we have Uzair and then Omar.
Anji.
Rafay, that was a fantastic presentation. I have a couple questions regarding the court cases that you mentioned. The Katas Raj temple, I remember coming from Chakwal to Jhelum, and when we were on the hill, I saw that factory that had a huge white body of water, and I was told that this is because of the factory that is there, and people nearby, they can feel the salt in the air and even in their water. So what became of that case that you mentioned? And also the second, the canal road, I'm told that this there was a case, they won it a decade ago, but there was still this road widening that eventually happened. So that would be all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the cement plants story is actually very interesting. The cement plants in that part in Kyora and in the Salt Range were all introduced in the mid 2000s, and there were environmental challenges then. Us waqt Sayyid Mansoor Ali Shah was a lawyer. He actually challenged these cases. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. Or Supreme Court ne kaha ye aap bana le. And the impact has been something that the experts predicted. They said 15 years ago कि पानी कम पड़ जाएगा. They said 15 years ago कि हवाई आलूदगी होगी. But it's an example of industry being disproportionately powerful than environmental law. And what happened with Saqib Nisar 2 years ago is that there were complaints कि वहाँ पानी कम हो गया, दोबारा पानी कम हो गया है. The Supreme Court took notice and directed the cement plants to find alternate means of getting their water, and made them pay or made them provide bank guarantees to the tune of 1 billion rupees each, two cement plants. I understand that about 2 months ago, the Supreme Court allowed the two companies to withdraw those guarantees, which means there's no financial risk for them anymore. but the water problem hasn't gotten any better, unfortunately. As far as the canal case is concerned, there was a plan by the government of Punjab to widen the canal road, and there was civil society opposition, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court, which came up with a judgment. The judgment had 16 recommendations, of which there are 3 that are important. The first was that the entire belt of canal would be protected as a heritage site, but that the cost of that would be to allow certain portions of the road to be widened at that time, and lay provision for further widenings. So whilst parts of the canal were widened, please know that the citizens of Lahore got Pakistan's first heritage park by law created. उस कानून के तहत कनाल के इर्द गिर्द कहीं भी infrastructure development की इजाजत नहीं है, unless you have very high level approval. The outcome of that case is disputed between some civil society activists and, for example, myself, who would accuse me of trying to hide my defeat, which is essentially what some people say happened. But the point with activism, and this is my learning from it, is that when you do activism, you never win or lose. You are always fighting. And this is even true with public policy. There is no final decision in public policy. There's no right decision in public. The decision you make changes the world, and then you have to make a bunch of decisions afterwards. And what it taught me is that you have to constantly engage. There have been attempts to widen the canal since. There have been attempts to introduce infrastructure development there. And civil society has been relatively successful because of that law to be able to stop most of those development projects. So in the trajectory of activism, it's a fantastic example of civil society's activism resulting not just in law, but in consistent protection of natural resources.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So we have a lot of hands, and in the interest of time, can we take a few questions first, and then you can probably comprehensively answer?
Sure, I'll try.
So we'll start with Umar and then Maha. और फिर से दोरी, आप बताएं.
Thanks so very much, Rafay, for all the advocacy you've been doing for climate change over the years. We've been following you, and we hope that it will get better with the time. Just a few quick questions, just one quick question. I have a lot of questions, but I would just limit this opportunity for one little question. What are our carbon emission targets that we signed with the Paris agreements? Can we have some resources anywhere? Because Climate Change Ministry website doesn't mean it lacks all those information and we don't have anything over there. What are the resources we can actually see what we have signed with Paris agreement?
Thank you, Umar. Ji Maha.
Okay.
Hello, Rafay. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. So my question is basically that, apart from fuel, I think engines really need to be maintained to kind of limit criteria pollutants and carbon emissions. By doing that, a large part of this cost, the 5 billion that you speak of, that can be transferred to the consumers, which is necessary at this point, right? And I think it also drives incentive in the right direction. It gives us an incentive to go for electrical vehicles, because at the end of the day, financial incentive hi kaam karta hai. Very few people are going to opt for an electrical vehicle out of, a conscious decision. So there are a lot of exhaust fume treatments out there, like NOx traps hote hain, SCR hota hai, catalytic converters hote hain. Is there any movement on part of the law towards that direction? Like, is cheez pe koi kaam nahi hai is waqt?
No, not much. There is a vehicle inspecting testing service that the government of Punjab has launched, which is very limited in its scope. There are only 1 or 2 centers where you can have tests for your automobiles. There are plans to fund an expansion of this network. And I'll give you some details because it's an interesting way of rolling out the plan. You see, what they've identified in Punjab, at least, is that intercity trucks, they are disproportionately polluting compared to other vehicles. they're also fewer in number, and they enter and exit cities at predetermined points. So it's relatively easy to set up 2 or 3 monitoring centers and get most of the intercity traffic or intercity goods transport traffic tested that way. So small number of cars, but majority of the pollution. And so they want to start that way. And the real challenge is then to actually roll it out to all private sector vehicles, because that would, require car owners to do things that they don't do right now. But ऐसी कोई बड़ी बात नहीं, 2 साल पहले लोग सीट बेल्ट नहीं पहनते थे, अब सीट बेल्ट पहनते हैं. No harm, no foul. But before I forget, I am doing 2 questions. I want to respond to that about what Pakistan's doing in terms of climate change in Paris. The Paris Agreement is a voluntary document that requires nations to their utmost ambitions, to set out their utmost ambition to reduce greenhouse gases. That's the point of the Paris Agreement, but it's voluntary. And what countries do is they submit to the United Nations their contributions to greenhouse gas emission reductions. Every country is responsible to file a piece of paper saying, "Hum itni contribution karenge greenhouse gas kam karne ke liye." And that's obligatory on everyone. Almost everyone. I mean, it's obligatory in different ways. Without getting into details, it's obligatory on that, common but differentiated responsibility basis. So what I have here is a slide that shows Pakistan's submission under Paris made in 2017. And what it does is you're supposed to tell Paris what your greenhouse gas emissions in 2015 were and what your projected greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years or in the long term would be. And so what you can see is that in 2015, Pakistan assessed that it had about 400 million metric tons of carbon emissions on an annual basis. And putting that into context, what that means is Pakistan is about 130 or 135 on a list of all countries that produce greenhouse gases. And this is Pakistan's argument that, look, we're not a big greenhouse gas emitter. And so, mitigation is not our headache, is essentially the argument. But if you look carefully, Pakistan's nationally determined contribution under Paris was submitted during the zenith of the CPEC development, when all these coal-fired plants were being introduced, and we were hoping to have economic development of 8% every single year. So what we projected into the future, our great ambition to reduce greenhouse gases, actually sees Pakistan's greenhouse gas emissions increasing 400% to 1,600 million metric tons by 2030. And to put that into context, that would put Pakistan next to where Japan is today, at number 9 on the list of greenhouse gas emitting countries. So that's Pakistan's formal submission under Paris. It's not a reduction in greenhouse gases. Indeed, Pakistan says that it intends to reduce 20% of its 2030 projected greenhouse gas emissions. This is our promise. कि हमारे 15 साल में ग्रीन हाउस गैस एमिशंस 400% बढ़ेंगे, मगर हम इनको 20% कम कर देंगे. We will cut them up to 20%, subject to the availability of international grants that meet the total abatement cost for that 20%, amounting to $40 billion. $40 billion कहते हैं हम. So our official statement under Paris is that we're going to increase our greenhouse gases by 400%. We'll reduce them 20% only if you give us $40 billion.
Thank you, sir. We'll take, if you can take 2 more questions. Is that allowed?
Sure.
All right. We'll have Asra and then Saduri.
Hi, Ahmed. Thank you for your session today. I apologize if you have covered this in your session already. I had to be in and out of it. So you've been rather critical of the government's billion tree tsunami project, and maybe wrongly so or rightly so. Can you clarify your stance on it, or why you've been critical on it? Otherwise, you might know where my question is stemming from. But
I'm not critical. I think anyone who plants trees is doing God's work. I truly believe that from my heart, right? But if you're going to tell me that planting trees is going to fix pollution, I'm not going to believe you.
Yes.
Because that's not how it works. And although if in the history of the human civilization, which in my view will probably be written in 500 years because we're burning the planet to a crisp, in the history of the human civilization, there will be not a footnote, there'll be a chapter that there was one country that tried a remarkable Hail Mary to plant 10 billion trees to sort of store carbon that had been thrown into the atmosphere. We will be celebrated for it. But the truth is, given how much the earth is warming, the Paris Agreement is meant to keep us within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial temperatures. We are at 1.1 degree today. We are projected to smash through 1.5 and 2 degrees by 2030, 2040. We're looking at 3 degrees by mid-century. 3 degrees of warming. There is not a seed on earth that can withstand 3 degrees of temperature. There is not a tree living on earth today that will survive this temperature increase unless we do something, unless we reduce greenhouse gases. So while it's great to be planting trees, the fight is in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now here the politics plays a bit of an illusion because we are told that Pakistan is not a big greenhouse gas emitter.
Yeah.
Hamari galti nahi hai. This is America and China at play, right? And so hum being a small country, we can't really reduce our greenhouse gases, so we're planting trees instead, is the argument. And so when I say planting trees is not going to solve anything, people are like, well, why are you against this? Because Pakistan is not a big greenhouse gas emitter. The fact is, where we are with climate change, the idea that developing countries have a little bit of a leeway in polluting compared to developed countries is no longer valid. You know, we are at dangerous, it is now every country's responsibility to reduce greenhouse gases. And so when I'm told as a diversion ki hum darakht laga rahe hain, I have to remind people ki yaar dekho, NEPRA, which is Pakistan's energy regulator, has notified tariffs on renewable energy, solar and wind, which are cheaper than all the other fossil fuel tariffs, including coal. So while it's sustainable and cheaper financially to run renewable energy in Pakistan, why on earth are we still investing in coal-fired power plants? Because that's an increase in greenhouse gas emissions that not just is immoral, but is also expensive. So please don't, you know, get me stuck on the trees over here when I'm trying to get you to address your energy policy. Because if you fix your energy policy, that's 20% of your air pollution as well. Trees are fantastic, but they're not going to solve the climate crisis.
I absolutely agree.
Thank you for that response. Rafay, I also had a very brief question about how we fare regionally, because there is this new discourse on Twitter about how this is our opening to become some kind of regional leaders. We need to be the flag bearers of climate change, and this is the route one must take when it comes to diplomacy with India. And we've been floating proposals to SAARC, spearheaded by the Supreme Court, of course. So if you could make a comment on that, please.
Well, let me I'm going to answer this slightly differently. I think that I think the climate debate is split in the discourse that comes from the global north, which is developed world, which is a very strong discourse about greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very strong discourse, okay, we've got to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. It's very strong in identifying who's responsible. I mean, I can tell you that there are 90 companies that are responsible for about 60% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. मैं उनका नाम आपको बता सकता हूँ. That's a fantastic northern or global north discourse on climate change. And all of these arguments have, you know, are so well articulated and personified, for instance, in the person of Greta Thunberg or Extinction Rebellion or other organizations that are doing fantastic work. Magar, मैं समझता हूँ कि this is a global north discourse. We are the people who suffer climate change. Pakistan suffers climate change because we are poor. We don't have a discourse of how climate change is affecting us, right? जो मैं भी आज greenhouse gas की बातें कर रहा हूँ, मैं essentially global north की बात कर रहा हूँ. अगर हम पाकिस्तान में climate change की बात करें, we have to have our own bad guys. Shell and Saudi Aramco aren't bad guys in Pakistan, and they might not be. But Pakistan is a water-stressed country. For example, हमें कहा जाता है कि water stressed है, पानी बहुत कम है, और हमें कहा जाता है most water is used in agriculture, 90%. और फिर हमें बताया जाता है 4 major cash crops: rice, cotton, wheat, and sugarcane. ठीक है जी? अब देखिए, we actually export more rice than we consume in Pakistan. We export, in 2019, we exported $420 million worth of ethanol. There are 90 sugar mills in Pakistan. फिर इनको Rice Exporters Association से पूछे ना कि पानी कहाँ जा रहा है. They're packaging it all and sending it abroad, and we're being told it's a water scarce country. So if you start articulating a Pakistani discourse on climate change, it actually sounds much different from petrol is bad, fossil fuels are bad. You start talking about how water is being deprived from communities and being inequitably apportioned amongst the rich. And it's that type of language that I so desperately think we need. Because जब मैं environment field के अंदर आ रहा था कोई 10-12 साल पहले, I mean माहौलियाती कानून के 20 साल नहीं हुए, और 23 years हो गए. There was hardly anyone practicing environment. I mean, there were hardly any graduates in Pakistan. But अब 10-12 साल बाद, we have university graduates with experience in the field. भाई 20 साल पहले जब आप किसी से climate change के बारे में पाकिस्तान से पूछते थे, you had to fly in a foreign consultant to tell Pakistanis what climate change was. So a lot of our climate policy is Western discourse, अंग्रेजी में लिखा गया है, and it's top down. But I think there's enough capacity in Pakistan, enough expertise in Pakistan that if we just shut up for a second, we take our expertise, मुंह बंद कर दें और लोगों की बात सुने ना, people who are affected by climate change are the cutting edge of global South climate policy. और इनकी आवाज सुननी चाहिए.
Are we not saying that already, that we are amongst the front lines of, suffering from climate change? I thought the PM
we only say that because we say, look, we say Pakistan is vulnerable to climate change. We are very poor. Give us money or terrorism. This is the sort of policy line we take at the international sort of arena. And, it only goes that far. It's only gone that far. Or that's also not how money is going to flow. Jitna hum दरख्त लगाएं या कहें कि ये गवर्नमेंट ग्रीन है, the truth of the matter is the Pakistani establishment is stuck to fossil fuels. It doesn't matter which government it is. हम जो गाड़ियां चलाते हैं, हम जिस तरह का पावर प्लांट्स आज लगा रहे हैं, they are committing us to a life of fossil fuel consumption.
Well, that was fantastic, Rafay. Thank you very much for joining us. My inbox is actually glutted with appreciation and questions right now. But
thank you so much, everyone.
Can we share your presentation?
Listen, I know there are a lot of unanswered questions, but ask the fellowship team. They'll share my email. I'm more than willing and more than able to answer your queries. I'm always available. Love to talk about the
Thank you very much, sir. We'll take it up on Twitter too. We all follow you.
Thank you for your time. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, everyone.
Thank you, Rafay.
Thank you so much.